Monday, March 14th, 1949, 9:47 a.m. Mime Johnson, who had been married to Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson for exactly 5 months and 11 days, opened the door of their third-floor apartment at 478 West 140th Street to find a white man in his late 50s standing in the hallway holding a manila envelope and an expression that combined nervous determination with poorly concealed contempt. The man, whose name was Gordon Whitmore and who owned the 6-story apartment building that contained 24 units occupied primarily by Negro families, had inherited the property from his father in 1946 and had maintained what he considered a reasonable, if uncomfortable, arrangement with his predominantly black tenants for the past 3 years, collecting rents that were approximately twice what white tenants paid for comparable apartments in other neighborhoods, while providing minimal maintenance and repairs that kept the building functional, if not particularly comfortable. But Whitmore had recently concluded, based on conversations with other white property owners in the neighborhood, and his own growing discomfort with Harlem's changing demographics, that he no longer wanted to be a landlord for Negro tenants, particularly Negro tenants who lived the kind of lifestyle that made police officers appear at the building asking questions and made other white landlords warn him that he was renting to dangerous people. Mame, who at 35 years old had lived in Harlem for 11 years, and who had experienced enough racism in her lifetime to recognize it instantly, regardless of how politely it presented itself, looked at Whitmore without speaking, and waited for him to explain his presence at her door at nearly 10 o'clock on a Monday morning. Whitmore, who had rehearsed this conversation in his mind, but who found the actual execution more difficult than anticipated when faced with a well-dressed Negro woman standing in the doorway of an apartment that was clearly more expensive and better furnished than the cheap tenement housing he associated with colored people, cleared his throat and explained that he was providing her with formal notice of eviction. Whitmore, who had rehearsed this conversation in his mind, but who found the actual execution more difficult than anticipated when faced with a well-dressed Negro woman standing in the doorway of an apartment that was clearly more expensive and better furnished than the cheap tenement housing he associated with colored people, cleared his throat and explained that he was providing her with formal notice of eviction, that she and her husband had 30 days to vacate the premises, and that this decision was final and not subject to negotiation. When Mime asked why they were being evicted, given that their rent was always paid on time and that they had never caused any problems that would justify such action, Whitmore's face flushed slightly, and he stated that as the property owner he had the right to choose his tenants, and that he had decided that the Johnsons no longer fit what he was looking for in residents of his building. The carefully neutral phrasing did not disguise the racial motivation. Mame, who had been born in North Carolina and who had moved to New York in 1938, specifically to escape the more overt and violent forms of Southern racism, understood immediately that Gordon Whitmore was evicting them because he did not want Negro tenants regardless of how much rent they paid or how respectably they lived. She also understood, though Whitmore probably did not, that he had made a catastrophic error in judgment by attempting to evict Bumpy Johnson without first investigating exactly who Bumpy Johnson was and what resources he could bring to bear against someone who insulted him. Mime accepted the eviction notice without argument, thanked Whitmore with the kind of excessive politeness that conveyed contempt more effectively than direct hostility, and closed the door. Then she walked to the telephone in the living room and called her husband at the office he maintained on Lenox Avenue, where he conducted the business of managing Harlem's numbers, rackets, and coordinating with his Italian mob partners regarding the distribution of various illegal enterprises throughout the neighborhood. Bumpy Johnson arrived home at 11:15 a.m., read the eviction notice carefully, asked Mame several questions about Whitmore's demeanor and exact phrasing, and then sat in silence for approximately 3 minutes while he considered his response. Johnson, who was 43 years old, and who had been involved in organized crime since his teenage years, and who had spent the period from 1946 to the present building what was arguably the most sophisticated and well-connected criminal organization in Harlem's history, had developed a philosophy about insults and disrespect that guided much of his strategic thinking. Small insults from insignificant people could be ignored because they cost nothing and meant nothing, but insults that were public or that suggested vulnerability or that came from people who should have known better. Those insults required responses that were proportional to the offense, and that sent clear messages about the consequences of disrespect. A racist landlord attempting to evict him from his home 5 months after his marriage, using transparent lies about tenant selection to disguise racial discrimination that was not a small insult from an insignificant person. That was a public challenge that required a response forceful enough that every other landlord in Harlem would hear about it, and would think carefully before attempting similar actions against him or against any other Negro tenant who might have connections to him. Johnson made his first phone call at 11:30 a.m. to Frank Costello, the Italian mob boss who controlled the Genovese crime family and with whom Johnson had maintained a carefully calibrated partnership since 1946 that granted him autonomy over Harlem's criminal operations in exchange for a percentage of profits and consultation rights on major decisions. Costello, who was 68 years old and who had been involved in organized crime since before Prohibition, and who had survived and prospered through decades of mob wars and law enforcement pressure by understanding when to use violence and when to use influence, listened to Johnson's account of the eviction attempt and immediately grasped both the racial insult involved and the opportunity it presented to demonstrate the value of his partnership with Johnson. "You want me to have someone break his legs?" Costello asked, his tone suggesting this was a reasonable first option. "No," Johnson replied. "I want to buy his building." This week, before his 30-day eviction notice even starts to matter. "I want him to arrive at his property on Friday morning and discover that he no longer owns it, and that I'm his former tenant, who is now his former landlord." Costello was quiet for several seconds, and when he spoke again there was approval in his voice. "That's smarter than breaking his legs, and it sends a better message. You need cash or connections, or both." Johnson explained what he needed. The building at 478 West 140th Street was worth approximately $85,000 based on recent comparable sales in the neighborhood, though Whitmore would probably sell for $70,000 if pressured correctly, because he clearly wanted out of the Harlem rental market and would likely accept a below-market offer if it came quickly and with minimal complications. Johnson had approximately $40,000 in liquid assets that he could access immediately, which meant he needed either a loan for the remaining $30,000 or he needed Costello's people to apply enough pressure on Whit that he would accept $40,000 for a property worth nearly double that amount. Costello considered both options and chose the latter. "I'll have my real estate people contact Whitmore today. They'll make it clear that if he wants to sell his Harlem properties, and we know he owns 3 buildings in the neighborhood, not just the one you're in, then he needs to accept our offer, which will be $40,000 cash for 478 West 140th Street with closing by Friday. If he resists, we'll explain to him that property ownership in Harlem is becoming complicated for white landlords, that there have been incidents of buildings experiencing problems with inspectors and unions and mysterious fires, and that smart property owners are taking reasonable offers while they're still available." Johnson's second call was to William Constler, the attorney who had represented him in previous legal matters and who maintained a practice that specialized in navigating the complex intersection of legitimate business and criminal enterprise. Constler, who understood that Johnson's money was as good as anyone else's, and that representing Harlem's most powerful crime boss provided both financial rewards and a certain degree of professional protection, agreed to handle the purchase transaction, conduct the title search, arrange for the property transfer, and ensure that all legal documents were filed properly with the city by Friday afternoon. When Constler asked if there were any complications that might delay the closing, Johnson explained that Frank Costello's people would be handling the seller's motivation and that he anticipated no resistance. Once Whitmore understood his options, Constler, who had learned over the years not to ask detailed questions about how his clients achieved their objectives, simply noted that he would have the paperwork ready and would coordinate with whatever attorney represented Whitmore to ensure the fastest possible closing. By 2 p.m. on Monday, March 14th, Gordon Whitmore received a phone call at his office in Midtown Manhattan from a man who identified himself as Anthony Ricci, a real estate broker representing clients interested in purchasing rental properties in Harlem. Ricci explained that his clients had heard that Whitmore owned several buildings in the neighborhood and might be interested in selling given the changing demographics and the increasing difficulties that white landlords faced in managing predominantly Negro tenant populations. When Whitmore, who had been considering selling his Harlem properties for several months, but had not yet actively pursued buyers. Asked how Ritchie had learned about his potential interest, Ritchie explained vaguely that his clients had extensive networks throughout the real estate community, and made it their business to identify opportunities before they became widely known. He then made an offer that was carefully calculated to appeal to Whitmore's desire to exit the Harlem rental market, while also being low enough that Whitmore would understand there was pressure involved. $40,000 cash for 478 West 140th Street, with closing by Friday, March 18th, all paperwork handled by the buyer's attorney. No complications, no delays. Money in your bank account by the end of the week. Whitmore, who understood that $40,000 was significantly below market value for a building worth $85,000, initially refused. Ritchie, whose tone remained professionally pleasant, but whose words carried unmistakable implications, explained that his clients were prepared to purchase all three of Whitmore's Harlem properties at similar valuations if Whitmore was interested in a complete exit from the neighborhood, but that this offer was time-sensitive and would not remain available indefinitely. He also mentioned in passing that property ownership in Harlem had become increasingly complicated recently, that several white landlords had experienced unfortunate incidents involving building inspections, union problems, and even some fires that the authorities had been unable to prevent or investigate effectively. The message was clear enough that Whitmore, who had no experience with organized crime but who had heard enough stories about mob influence in New York real estate to understand when he was being threatened, asked for time to consider the offer. Tuesday morning, March 15th, Whitmore received visits from 3 different city inspectors, all of whom had been encouraged through various channels to conduct thorough examinations of the properties at 478 West 140th Street, 492 West 140th Street, and 511 West 141st Street. The inspectors, who approached their work with unusual zeal, discovered violations ranging from inadequate fire escapes to faulty electrical wiring to plumbing problems to structural issues that would require immediate and expensive repairs. The combined cost of addressing all identified violations across the 3 properties was estimated at approximately $35,000 in expense that would eliminate most of Whitmore's profit margin from his Harlem rental income for the next 3 years. When Whitmore called the buildings department to complain about what seemed like coordinated harassment, he was told politely that the inspections had been routine and that the violations were legitimate, and that he was welcome to contest the citations through the normal appeals process, which would probably take 18 months to resolve, during which time he would be prohibited from collecting rent on any units that failed to meet code requirements. Tuesday afternoon, Whitmore received another call from Anthony Ritchie, who asked pleasantly if he had reconsidered the purchase offer. When Whitmore explained that he was now facing $35,000 in violation repairs that would need to be factored into any sale price, Ritchie expressed sympathy but noted that his clients were purchasing the properties and that the violations were Whitmore's responsibility to address before closing if he wanted to maintain his current tenants, or that he could sell immediately for the offered price and let the new owners handle the repairs however they chose. Ritchie also mentioned that he had heard about the inspection problems, and that it was unfortunate how these things seemed to happen all at once, almost as if someone had triggered a coordinated review, and that his client's offer represented an opportunity to avoid further complications. Whitmore, who was beginning to understand that he was not simply dealing with a lowball offer from opportunistic buyers, but rather with a coordinated pressure campaign from people with connections throughout city government and the real estate industry, asked for another day to consider. Wednesday morning, March 16th, Whitmore's insurance broker called to inform him that his property insurance policies for the 3 Harlem buildings were being canceled, effective immediately, due to what the insurance company described as elevated risk profiles based on recent inspection reports and neighborhood conditions. The broker explained apologetically that several insurance companies had recently revised their underwriting standards for properties in predominantly Negro neighborhoods, and that Whitmore would need to find new coverage, probably at significantly higher premiums, if he wanted to maintain adequate protection against fire and liability claims. When Whitmore asked how the insurance company had learned about inspection reports that had only been filed the previous day, the broker had no explanation but noted that information moved quickly in the real estate insurance industry. Without insurance, Whitmore could not legally lease apartments, which meant that his rental income would stop entirely until he secured new coverage, a process that might take weeks and that would certainly cost substantially more than his previous policies. Wednesday afternoon, March 16th, Gordon Whitmore called Anthony Ricci and accepted the offer of $40,000 for 478 West 140th Street with a closing date of Friday, March 18th. Ricci expressed satisfaction with Whitmore's decision and assured him that the buyer's attorney would have all necessary paperwork ready for signature by Thursday morning and that funds would be transferred to Whitmore's bank account immediately upon closing. When Whitmore asked if the buyers would also be interested in his other two Harlem properties, Ricci replied that his clients would consider additional purchases but only after the first transaction closed successfully and only at valuations that reflected the current market conditions and risk profiles. The message was clear. If Whitmore wanted to sell his other buildings, he would need to accept similar below-market offers and would receive no sympathy about the financial losses involved. Thursday morning, March 17th, William Kunstler met with Whitmore and his attorney at a Midtown office to review and sign the purchase documents for 478 West 140th Street. Whitmore, who had spent the previous night calculating his losses and considering his options, signed the papers with visible reluctance and asked Kunstler who the actual buyer was, given that the purchase documents listed a corporate entity rather than an individual name. Kunstler explained that the property was being purchased by Lenox Development Corporation, a real estate holding company based in Harlem, and that the principals of the corporation preferred to maintain privacy regarding their investment activities. When Whitmore asked if the corporation had any connection to organized crime, Kunstler replied with the carefully neutral phrasing that attorneys use when they want to avoid perjury, while also avoiding direct answers. That Lenox Development Corporation was a legitimate business entity that paid its taxes and conducted its affairs in accordance with applicable laws. Whitmore understood that he had sold his building to people connected to the mob, possibly the same people who had orchestrated the inspection problems and insurance cancellation. But by that point, he simply wanted to complete the transaction and receive his money before anything else went wrong. Friday morning, March 18th at 8:15 a.m., exactly 4 days after Gordon Whitmore had delivered an eviction notice to Bumpy Johnson's door, Whitmore arrived at 478 West 140th Street, planning to begin the process of inspecting the building and preparing for the transition to new ownership. He found Bumpy Johnson standing in the lobby of the building, dressed in a $100 suit, holding a clipboard with what appeared to be tenant lease agreements, and speaking with 3 of the building's Negro residents about building maintenance issues that needed to be addressed. When Whitmore asked what Johnson was doing in the building, Johnson looked at him with an expression of polite confusion and explained that he was conducting landlord business, reviewing tenant concerns and planning renovation projects that would improve the property. When Whitmore stated that he was still the landlord and that Johnson had no authority to discuss building matters with other tenants, Johnson pulled a document from his jacket pocket and handed it to Whitmore. The document was a property deed, filed with the New York City Register's office on Thursday, March 17th at 4:47 p.m., transferring ownership of the premises known as 478 West 140th Street from Gordon Whitmore to Lenox Development Corporation, and a corporate resolution dated the same day appointing Ellsworth Raymond Johnson as managing director of Lenox Development Corporation with full authority to operate and manage all properties owned by the corporation. Whitmore stared at the documents for several seconds, his face transitioning from confusion to recognition to anger to something approaching fear as he understood exactly what had happened. The buyer that Anthony Ricci had represented was Bumpy Johnson. The pressure campaign that had forced him to sell at a below-market price was orchestrated by the Negro tenant he had tried to evict. The man standing in front of him holding tenant lease agreements was now his former landlord, the person who had purchased the building that Whitmore had owned for 3 years and had inherited from his father, who had owned it for 20 years before that. Johnson, who had been waiting for this moment since Monday morning when Mame had handed him the eviction notice, allowed this silence to extend for several seconds while Whitmore processed the implications of what he was seeing. Then he spoke in a tone that was calm, professional, and absolutely devoid of sympathy. "Mr. Whit, you are no longer the owner of this building. You sold it to my company on Thursday afternoon. I am now responsible for all tenant relations, building maintenance, rent collection, and property management decisions. Your eviction notice to my wife and me is void because you no longer have the legal authority to evict anyone from premises and I suggest you leave this building now, and I suggest you don't come back unless you're invited, because you are now trespassing on private property. And I would hate to have to call the police to remove you." Whitmore, whose face had gone from red to pale to some combination of both as the full scope of his miscalculation became clear, stammered something about the sale price being unfair and about pressure, tactics, and about connections to organized crime that should be investigated. Johnson interrupted him. "You tried to evict my family from our home because we're Negro. You used your position as landlord to exercise racial discrimination that you thought I could unfight because I am black, and you re-white, and because you assumed that property ownership gave you power that I could unchallenge. You were wrong about all of that. I had more resources, more connections, and more leverage than you imagined. And now you've learned a lesson that I hope you remember for the rest of your life. In Harlem, in 1949, there are Negro men with enough power to buy your building out from under you in 4 days when you insult them. Remember. Tell your friends. Make sure every other white landlord in this neighborhood understands what happens when you try to evict Bumpy Johnson, or anyone connected to him." Gordon Whitmore left the building and never returned. He attempted to sell his other 2 Harlem properties within the following month, but found that potential buyers had heard about his forced sale of 478 West 140th Street and assumed that any property he was selling quickly must have serious problems that justified below-market offers. He eventually sold both buildings for approximately 60% of their market value to buyers who were connected to various Harlem criminal organizations, though he could never prove that these sales were coordinated or that he was being systematically forced out of property ownership in the neighborhood as retaliation for his attempt to evict Johnson. Within a year, Whitmore had divested himself of all Harlem real estate holdings and had relocated his remaining business interests to New Jersey, where he convinced himself that property management would be simpler and more profitable in communities that remained predominantly white. Johnson retained ownership of 478 West 140th Street for the next 2 years, during which time he spent approximately $15,000 on renovations. That included repairing all the violations that city inspectors had identified, upgrading the building's electrical and plumbing systems, installing new windows and improved heating, and modernizing the common areas. He maintained the existing tenants at their current rent levels, which were still inflated compared to similar apartments in white neighborhoods, but which were at least now justified by significantly improved building conditions. The property became known throughout Harlem as an example of how Negro landlords could manage buildings better than white landlords who viewed their Harlem properties purely as sources of profit extracted from captive tenant populations who had no choice but to accept substandard conditions. In 1951, shortly before his arrest and conviction on heroin conspiracy charges that sent him to Alcatraz for 11 years, Johnson sold 478 West 140th Street for $95,000. A $10,000 profit over his purchase price plus renovation costs, and used the proceeds to establish a trust fund that provided financial support to Mame during his imprisonment. The story of how Bumpy Johnson bought his landlord's building in 4 days after receiving an eviction notice spread rapidly through Harlem and became one of the defining examples of how he exercised power during his most influential period. The story was told in barbershops and bars and church basements and street corners, each telling, adding details that may or may not have been accurate, but that reinforced the essential narrative. A racist white landlord had tried to evict Bumpy and his wife. Bumpy had mobilized his connections to Italian organized crime, city inspectors, insurance companies, and real estate brokers. Within 4 days, the building had changed hands. The landlord had been forced to sell at a substantial loss. Bumpy had become the property owner, and the eviction notice had become worthless paper. The message that Harlem residents took from this story was both empowering and complicated. It demonstrated that Negro people with sufficient resources and connections could fight back against racism and win. But it also demonstrated that those resources and connections typically came from involvement in criminal enterprises, because legitimate economic power was still largely denied to black Americans in 1949. For Mame Johnson, who had opened her door on Monday morning to receive an eviction notice, and who by Friday morning was living in an apartment building owned by her husband rather than by a racist white landlord, the incident confirmed something she had already suspected about the man she had married 5 months earlier. Bumpy was not simply a criminal who ran numbers rackets and distributed heroin. He was a strategist who understood systems, who could activate complex networks of influence across multiple domains, who could accomplish in 4 days what most people could not accomplish in 4 years, and who viewed insults not as personal affronts to be answered with violence, but as problems to be solved through the application of intelligence, connections, and carefully calibrated pressure. When she asked him later that Friday if he had bought the building primarily to solve their eviction problem, or primarily to send a message to other landlords about the consequences of discriminating against Negro tenants with power, Johnson replied that he had done both because good strategy always accomplished multiple objectives simultaneously. The building, at 478 West 140th Street, stood for another 40 years before being demolished in 1989 as part of an urban renewal project that transformed much of that section of Harlem. But during the period from 1949 to 1989, the building maintained a reputation as the place where Bumpy Johnson had reversed an eviction and bought his landlord's property in less than a week. Former tenants who lived there during Johnson's ownership remembered that rents remained stable, that repairs were made promptly, that the building was well maintained, and that living there carried a certain status because of its connection to Harlem's most legendary crime boss. The incident became part of the mythology that surrounded Johnson throughout his life, and after his death, a story that illustrated his power, his intelligence, his connections, and his willingness to use all of these assets to defend not just his own dignity, but the dignity of all Negro Harlemites who lived under the constant threat of discrimination from white landlords who controlled much of the neighborhood's housing stock. Gordon Whitmore died in 1967 at age 75. 1 year before Bumpy Johnson suffered a fatal heart attack at Wells Restaurant in Harlem. Whitmore's obituary in a New Jersey newspaper made no mention of his former Harlem real estate holdings or the circumstances under which he had sold them. But among the dwindling number of people who remembered the incident, Whitmore's name remained synonymous with the foolishness of underestimating Negro criminals with connections, the dangers of casual racism when directed at people with power, and the speed with which property ownership could change hands when someone with mob connections and strategic thinking decided that buying your building was the best way to answer an insult. The eviction notice that Whitmore had delivered to Mame Johnson's door on Monday, March 14, 1949, had represented what he thought was the exercise of legitimate property owner authority over tenants he no longer wanted. By Friday, March 18, 1949, it had become evidence of the biggest mistake of his life, a mistake that cost him $85,000 building, his reputation in the real estate community, and any remaining illusion that skin color alone conferred power in Harlem when that power confronted someone who had spent decades building networks of influence that transcended racial boundaries and extended into every power structure in New York City.